All right, everyone, welcome to today's episode of Cognition Ignition with C-Class. Today, I am going to be starting my conversation about the difference between Socionics and Myers-Briggs type indicator. If you don't know anything about either of these, then I would recommend you learn the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which you can do by going over to my channel. There's a whole playlist of information on the cognitive functions and the types. When we get into socionics, it goes a little bit deeper. There are a lot of the same terms being used, but when you actually break them down, they're not used in the same way. And that's pretty much what I'm going to get into, is how you can use both systems, but how they're going to differ and where they overlap a little bit. I'm not going to go into everything today because usually my live streams are more to allow people to conversate with me, bring in their thoughts or questions, and then more formal videos I'll go into some of the more technical things. I just want to give everybody a pretty general overview of what's going on with the two. I notice when I start looking into socionics is that when you look at the introverted types, the last letter is going to change in most of the systems. I have noticed that a lot of people have found a way to bring the same type in the MBTI over to socionics without changing the last dichotomy from a judging or perceiving preference. I do think that's actually a really good idea to be able to not have the confusion. At the same time, I do understand why socionics wanted to change those around, and I'm going to explain it really quick. So if you look at an introverted judger in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, what you will notice is that they don't lead with a judging function. So like the INTJ is actually leading with introverted intuition, which is a perceiving function. It's how they create their perceptions of the world. It's the information that they're taking in. And then when you get into the INTP, they lead with decision-making function, but they're considered a perceiver. I do think there's a good reason for this in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, though it does cause some confusion. The one good thing that is good about the Myers-Briggs type indicator is that it's giving the perception. It's showing that somebody's a perceiver or a judger, because it's explaining growth and it's explaining how people should learn to grow. So in the Myers-Briggs type indicator, if you're a decision maker first, you're going to have to lead with if you lead with a decision making function, you're going to have to learn to develop a perceiving function. So when you use a tool that's teaching you growth, it kind of makes sense that it guides you towards the way of how you're supposed to grow. Just because that's the growth for somebody who is going to dominantly use their lead function of introverted thinking. And when you go into socionics, you will see that pretty much it's still considered you're still going to consider your first function your lead function, but what they actually do socionics, what they call them are information elements. And I think this is actually a good idea. I don't think there's as much confliction as people like to make it out to seem, because pretty much they're saying that it's not explaining brain wiring the way that MBTI would explain it. I think that it goes together. Certain parts are going to be processing certain bits of information certain ways and be willing to process certain bits of information more often. So when I think of it that way, that's how I'm thinking of it. Also, they do have something called functions in socionics, but what their functions are actually what we call function stacks in Myers-Briggs. So where we say we have the dominant and auxiliary function, that's actually both of those together make the entire function. So you're going to see that like function stacks are called, Seriously, this is why I told people that they shouldn't stay in this if they haven't learned about Myers and Briggs. So when you get into your functions in the socionics, it takes two. It takes an input and an output. And what they're explaining is that your first function is going to be your primary function. Your second function is going to be your creative function. You are going to use it for creative purposes. And I think that's really important to recognize. Then I think most people understand what polar is. It's used a lot in the MBTI. So they use that. They use that terminology. They use ignoring, functions that you will ignore. They use quite a few different terms. I want to make sure I use it all right. You have role functions, mobilizing functions, suggestive functions, ignoring functions, and demonstrative functions. And what they do is they classify each of these with other values. So I use values, but so they may say that you value this function, but you're weak at it. You don't value it, but it might be something you're strong at, or so that's really what you're getting at with this. Then also, they try to use some other terminology from psychology, which would be like the ego and the identity, and that's what they actually call it when you have two of these functions together. When you have like a lead function and a creative function together, that is called your ego. And then after that, you have a super ego, an identity, and a super identity. But what this is all really explaining to people is that there's going to be certain groups that work well together. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. And they actually do it by breaking it down to quadras. So I think they have alpha, beta, gamma, and delta quadras. And what those are people, if you're looking at it from a cognitive function view, which I haven't figured out fully, but I think this has to do with the J and the P being switched in socionics, but I think there's got to be a way to do this in MBTI. But if you take the quadras, you're going to have people who share all the same cognitive functions. And what that means is that they should be able to relate in some way. They also do use temperaments. They use it differently though, which kind of makes sense because they actually use the I in the J or the, so your first and last preference, the introvert, extrovert, judging, perceiving dichotomies is what they actually use to decide so they and what else? So I'm getting on the temperament. So when you're talking about the temperaments, they're using the introverted judging, extroverted judging, introverted perceiving, and extroverted perceiving to say temperaments. It kind of makes sense because you would think introvert, extrovert is really where you find somebody's temperament early on. Does somebody like to shop? And what they actually use temperaments as it is known in MBTI is the NT, SJ, SP, and NF temperaments. And I think those are actually really good to use. I like those ones better. I think the I and the J, that they're good for temperaments, but they don't explain so much. Where when I think you get into the way temperaments are explained in the Myers and Briggs, they definitely explain a lot more. And I think what Socionics does is they use another term, which they call them clubs, to take the NT, NF, SJ, and SP clubs. So the real thing that you're seeing here is like if you've taken a test, maybe you've taken a Socionics test and have mistyped because really they changed things a lot in this test. Though it's very relatable, it's not going to overlap with the Myers and Briggs because they're just changing terms around a lot. I do think there's definitely ways to incorporate it with Myers and Briggs a lot more. And I'm definitely that's pretty much how I got into this. I wanted to make sure that I'm if I'm going to type people, I want to do it accurately. I work on my computer programs, and I happened to stumble across some Socionics stuff, and I realized that what we use in computer programming for facial recognition and categorizing is also used a lot in Socionics to represent the information elements. They use things like triangles and squares and circles and like the L-shaped Tetris blocks. So I think when you're going into Socionics, you're not using it so much for personal development. You're using it for intertype relationships, how group dynamics are going to work out. I also think that it's probably going more towards like being able to type people without having to take a test, like based on it's based on more like mannerisms and behaviors, and pretty much a good way to think about it is like if somebody's ignoring you, it's because of their type and the information that you're kind of explaining to them. And that's how Socionics looks at it. Is like there's some people that will not process the information as you are presenting it. And then for other people who are presenting similar information, they may be presenting it in a way that people will be willing to take it. I think that's actually the best way to look at where the intertype relationships play out. And again, I think the fact that they want to change the last letter in Socionics kind of is what throws a lot of things off. I think that you can define the definitions a lot more by not changing those letters. Anyways, that's pretty much what I have for today. I'm putting together more formal videos. I usually like to make sure that I get these going beforehand because I like to hear what people actually think about the topics or what questions you guys have. Anyways, I will catch you on the next episode of Cognition Ignition with C-Class, and thanks a lot for watching.